am Sarah Donnelly, 19 years old, and my story begins in Buffalo, New York, on a night that carved itself into my memory like fire against skin. The dining room lights glared too bright. The heavy smell of roast beef filled the air, but the atmosphere was suffocating. A silence that throbbed between the clinks of forks and the shallow breaths of people pretending nothing was wrong. My mother, Janet, sat at the head of the table with her chin lifted, her eyes sharp with that familiar look of superiority. My father, Robert, occupied the other end, his face hidden behind a glass of whiskey, as if the amber liquid could shield him from responsibility. My brother, Ethan, sat across from me, smirking the way he always did, proud of his new engagement, and basking in the glow of parental praise. I sat quietly, folding my napkin tighter and tighter in my lap, hoping the evening would pass without eruption. But in my family, peace was fragile, a thread ready to snap at the slightest pull. The conversation started with wedding talk, as it always did in those days. Ethan bragged about his plans for an elaborate ceremony in Erie, Pennsylvania, and my parents nodded with admiration. They asked me no questions, offered me no smiles. I was the invisible one, the shadow in the corner who kept the family running, yet never received the credit. Ethan wanted more flowers, more decorations, more luxuries, and I finally gathered the courage to say that money was tight, that I could not keep draining myself to meet his endless demands. My voice shook, but I kept it steady, my eyes meeting my mother's for once instead of lowering my gaze. The pause after my words was sharp and cutting, as if I had shattered the natural order of our household. My father coughed into his glass. Ethan rolled his eyes and muttered that I was cheap. Then it happened. My mother's face twisted with rage. Her hand snapped toward her plate, and with a sudden, violent motion, she hurled it straight at me. The ceramic flew across the table, smashing against my shoulder shards, scattering on the floor. The sound of shattering porcelain echoed louder than thunder. I froze, pain radiating through my arm. My breath caught in my throat. The room was silent except for the ringing in my ears. My mother's voice cut through that silence like a knife. "Get out forever!" She screamed, her words vibrating with venom. There was no hesitation, no regret, only raw fury. My father sat still, expression blank, refusing to intervene. Ethan leaned back in his chair with a satisfied smirk, enjoying my humiliation. Tears burned in my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. I stood up the chair, scraping hard against the wooden floor, the sound like a warning bell. My body trembled, yet my steps were firm as I pushed back from the table. My hand clutched the edge of the chair for balance. My other hand brushed against the sting of broken porcelain on my skin. I looked at each of them. My mother's cold glare, my father's vacant stare, my brother's smug grin, and I realized none of them would ever see me as anything but disposable. Without another word, I turned, walked to the door, and grabbed my keys from the hook by the frame. The silence behind me was deafening until the heavy slam of the door broke it apart. Outside, the night air was biting cold, pressing against my skin as if to remind me I was alive, I was free, I was no longer trapped at that table. I leaned against my car, breath, shaky eyes wide, and for the first time in years, I felt the weight of defiance settle into my bones. I promised myself in that moment that I would never kneel to their cruelty again. The shattered plate remained on the floor inside a symbol of what they had done, but also of what I was about to become. If you were in my place, would you walk away forever or turn back to strike with equal force? Tell me in the comments, because I want to know what you would do when the people meant to love you become the ones who break you. When I tell people I grew up in Buffalo, New York, they imagine snow piled high against the sidewalks, football games, and neighbors waving from porches. They do not see the inside of my house where laughter was rationed, love was conditional, and every day felt like walking on glass. I was born into a family where appearances mattered more than truth, where my father Robert measured success by how much respect he could command at the local tavern, and my mother Janet measured worth by how well we polished the family image. My brother Ethan was the crown jewel in their carefully polished story. I was the forgotten stone shoved to the back of a dusty drawer. From the moment Ethan could walk, my parents praised him. He was the son who drew straight A's, the one Robert boasted about over beers, the one Janet showed off in Christmas letters with staged photos. My childhood memories are filled with their applause for Ethan's smallest victories, while my own accomplishments passed unnoticed. I remember bringing home a perfect spelling test in second grade. Janet glanced at the paper, muttered good, and then turned back to Ethan, who was chattering about his Little League game. The warmth that should have filled my chest drained away, replaced by a hollowness that became all too familiar. As the years passed, the imbalance grew sharper. Ethan was given freedom money for clubs, new clothes, a car when he turned 16. I was given chores and silence. When something broke in the house, I was blamed. When Ethan stayed out late, I was accused of distracting him. Once, when my father's beer glass slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor, his eyes turned to me, though I had been sitting quietly across the room. "Why can't you pay attention?" he barked as if I had willed the glass to fall. Janet chimed in, telling me to clean it up, muttering that I was careless. Ethan laughed, his voice sharp with mockery, and the sound of his amusement seared deeper than my father's bark. Physical moments were not constant, but they punctuated the years like thunderclaps in a storm that never cleared. I was slapped across the cheek for answering too quickly, shoved aside in the kitchen, when I dared ask for more food, grabbed by the arm, and shaken when I refused to obey fast enough. Each act left no visible scars long enough to prove, but the bruises inside me lasted. Still, I convinced myself if I stayed quiet, if I kept sacrificing, maybe they would one day look at me with pride. School had been my escape. Books opened worlds beyond Buffalo. Teachers noticed when I raised my hand. When I earned a partial scholarship to Erie Community College, I thought at last I had found a path out. I remember holding the letter in my hands, heart racing, believing this was the first step toward freedom. For a brief moment, I saw myself building a career in marketing, working for agencies in New York City, perhaps traveling, making my own name. But my family had other plans. The grocery store my parents owned on the east side of Buffalo had been in decline for years. Chains like Wegmans and Tops drew customers away. Shelves in our store grew emptier, bills piled higher. Janet called me into the kitchen one evening, her face pale, her voice laced with practiced sorrow. "We cannot manage anymore," she said. Robert stared at the floor, silent but heavy with expectation. They told me my scholarship was a luxury we could not afford, that family came first, that I had to help save the business. When I protested, saying this was my chance, Janet's hand struck my cheek with a swiftness that stunned me. "Do not be selfish," she hissed. And just like that, my dream folded back into its envelope, tucked away with the rest of my forgotten hopes. So I went to work in the store. Day after day, I stocked shelves, balanced books, and dealt with angry suppliers. Ethan never set foot behind the register. He was busy with law school applications paid for with money scraped together by selling off my college future. Customers noticed my presence, thanking me for keeping the shop alive, but at home there was no thanks. Robert muttered that I should be faster with invoices. Janet criticized my handwriting on signs. Ethan laughed that I would never be more than a cashier. Each word chipped away at me, yet I told myself to endure. One winter night, I stayed late to close the store, the streets outside buried in snow. I carried boxes heavier than my frame should have managed my back aching. As I locked the door, I saw Robert's car drive by slowly. He did not stop to offer a ride. He only looked at me through the fogged window, then turned away. That was my life in a single image, me struggling under weight, him pretending not to see. Despite the exhaustion, I still found moments to dream. I sketched marketing ideas in notebooks, slogans for local businesses, campaign designs that might have caught the eye of big companies. I applied quietly to small freelance projects online, earning a few $100s here and there. With every dollar I saved, I thought maybe one day I could still carve out a future. Yet every time I built up a little, another family emergency drained me. A broken freezer, an unpaid supplier. Robert's bar tab that had to be settled to avoid embarrassment. The little I scraped together vanished like water through fingers. My friends saw the toll. Nathan, a friend from high school, once met me at a diner and asked why I looked so tired. When I explained how much time I spent keeping the store alive, he shook his head. "They are blind," he told me. "You are killing yourself for nothing." I smiled weakly, stirred my coffee, and changed the subject, unwilling to admit he was right. Hope was a chain I could not break. At 19, while Ethan celebrated his acceptance into Cleveland's law program, I celebrated nothing. I worked more hours, brought home fewer smiles, and carried the invisible scars of years spent in a house where love was measured by how much you could endure without complaint. That was my backstory, the soil from which my eventual defiance would grow. The plate my mother hurled at me that night was not just porcelain. It was the embodiment of every dismissal, every sacrifice unnoticed, every bruise covered. And as it shattered, so did the last of my illusions that endurance could ever buy love. I was ready for something different, though I did not yet know what. My childhood had taught me one thing above all else: survival was possible. But respect had to be claimed, not begged for. By the time I turned 19, the grocery store was collapsing under the weight of debt. Shelves stood half empty, the hum of old refrigerators sounded like groans of a dying beast, and every supplier seemed one phone call away from cutting us off. I could feel the end creeping closer with every bill that arrived in the mail. Yet my parents acted as if the solution was simple. Squeeze me harder, bleed my savings, treat me as the family's emergency fund. Janet sat me down one cold February evening, the steam from her tea curling between us like smoke from a battlefield. Her voice was heavy with that practiced guilt she wielded so well. "We need $5,000 to keep the store afloat until spring," she said, not asking but declaring. My breath caught because that number was not just money. It was everything I had managed to save from freelance marketing jobs and long shifts at the coffee shop on Elmwood Avenue. I had been planning to put it toward community college again, perhaps try to restart what had been stolen from me. But the way she said it, the way Robert nodded silently beside her, left no room for refusal. If I hesitated, Janet's hand twitched like she was ready to strike again. I withdrew the money the next morning, sliding the bills across the counter to my mother without a thank you in return. She folded the envelope, tucked it into her purse, and moved on as if I were nothing more than a bank teller. My chest ached with anger, yet I swallowed it, convincing myself this would finally show them my worth. Maybe they would see I had sacrificed college freedom and now my entire savings for the family. That night, Robert raised his glass in a rare toast, but not to me. He toasted Ethan for his upcoming move to Cleveland to begin law school. The $5,000 I had just given away was not mentioned. Ethan grinned, soaking up the praise, and for a moment I thought I might choke on the bitterness rising inside me. The store limped forward a few more months. I worked longer hours than ever, arriving before dawn to stock shelves and staying past midnight to count the register. Still, the numbers never added up. Vendors called their voices impatient, reminding me of balances overdue. I begged for extensions, promising payment, while Ethan lived in an apartment near campus with furniture my parents proudly bought him. Each time I mailed a check to a supplier, I watched my own dreams shrink. My friends noticed my exhaustion. Nathan called one night asking if I could meet for coffee. I told him I could not. I was too busy working at the store. He sighed into the phone, frustrated. "You are carrying them on your back, Sarah, and they do not even see it." I wanted to scream that I knew he was right, but if I admitted it, then what reason would I have to keep going? The lie that someday my parents would recognize me was the only fuel I had left. One spring afternoon I came home from the store, my arms sore from hauling boxes, and found Ethan lounging on the couch with a brand new laptop glowing on his knees. Janet hovered proudly nearby, telling him how smart he looked. I asked quietly where the money had come from. Robert barely looked up from his newspaper as he muttered, "We had to support his studies. He is our future." I stared at the gleaming laptop, the price tag probably close to what I had just paid a supplier, and I felt my stomach twist. I wanted to shout that I had given everything, that without me there would be no store left to boast about. But I bit my tongue until I tasted blood. The worst moment came in early summer. The electric company threatened to cut service. Without power, the refrigerators would fail and the store would lose thousands in spoiled goods. Robert slammed the notice on the kitchen table, his eyes narrowing on me. "You better fix this," he barked. "Not us. Not we. You." I searched my bank account already drained from the last sacrifice and realized I had barely enough to cover rent and food for myself. Still, I found a way, taking extra shifts at the coffee shop selling the small jewelry my grandmother had left me. When I handed Janet the payment receipt, she said nothing, not a nod, not even a glance. She simply slid the paper into a drawer and walked away. Each sacrifice carved a deeper hollow in me. Ethan, meanwhile, returned home for weekends driving the car my parents had bought him years before his law textbooks stacked in the back seat like trophies. He boasted about professors, about future firms, while Janet and Robert listened with glowing eyes. When I tried to mention my marketing side projects, they dismissed them as hobbies. My worth was measured only by how much money I could give to the family store. The final blow came when Ethan announced his engagement to Lindsay Harper from Erie. My parents were ecstatic, planning a grand wedding as if money grew on trees. I sat quietly at the dinner table calculating the numbers in my head, realizing there was no way we could afford such a spectacle. But Janet had already turned to me with that familiar command in her eyes. "You will help," she said. Robert nodded in agreement. Ethan smirked. I wanted to refuse to say no more, but the weight of years of conditioning pressed me down. They had taken my college, my savings, my health, and now they would take whatever else I had. In that moment, something shifted inside me. I could feel the bitterness rising, not just as a silent ache, but as a spark, the beginning of a fire I could no longer suppress. They saw me as a resource to drain, not a daughter to love. Every dollar I gave was another chain around my neck, and I was suffocating. That summer of financial burden was not just about money, it was about control. Each time they demanded and I obeyed, they tightened their grip. Each time I gave in, they grew bolder, certain I would never resist. But in the cracks of my exhaustion, determination began to grow. I started to imagine a future where I was not their safety net, where my labor did not vanish into their greed. The 5,000 I had lost haunted me, but it also became a lesson. They would keep taking until nothing was left unless I learned to stop them. I remember one night lying awake staring at the ceiling of my small room, the hum of the city outside muffled by snow. My mind repeated one truth over and over. I was the only one who could change this. My parents would not suddenly wake up and thank me. Ethan would not give up his throne. If I wanted freedom, I had to claim it. That realization grew heavier each day until it became the seed of rebellion. I had given them everything, but soon, very soon, I would learn how to take something back. The evening that changed everything began with the kind of tension you can taste in the air before a storm. The table in the dining room gleamed under the overhead light. Plates set neatly, glasses filled with water, the roast in the center still steaming. At first glance, it looked like any other family dinner, but beneath the surface lay a current of unease that made my skin prickle. My mother, Janet, had insisted that tonight was important. My father, Robert, wore a collared shirt as if trying to look respectable, and Ethan, freshly engaged, leaned back in his chair with the smug satisfaction of a man who believed the world revolved around him. Lindsay Harper, his fiancée from Erie, sat quietly at his side, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her eyes darting nervously between us. I had worked all day at the store, my clothes still smelling faintly of cardboard and dust, but I forced myself to sit up straight to appear composed. I knew what was coming. The wedding had been the only topic of conversation for weeks. Ethan wanted extravagance flowers imported from across the country, lobster tails flown in fresh, a photographer who had shot for the governor's gala. It was a fantasy wedding, and my parents indulged him as if money were endless. I had already sunk $10,000 of my own hard-earned savings into the preparations, scraping together deposits with the hope that maybe, just maybe this time, my contribution would matter. Dinner began with small talk about guest lists, seating charts, and vendors. Ethan rattled off demands, and Janet nodded eagerly, scribbling notes on a pad she had placed beside her plate. Robert offered the occasional grunt of approval, though he barely looked up from his glass. Lindsay spoke little, her voice barely above a whisper when she agreed with Ethan's latest suggestion. I sat in silence, my fork resting against cold vegetables, my mind calculating the numbers over and over. I knew the truth. We had reached the limit. There was no more money, no more savings to drain, no more miracles to conjure. Finally, Ethan leaned forward, his voice louder, his eyes locked on me. "We need to upgrade the menu," he said. "Add lobster tails and that vintage champagne from Napa, and hire the photographer from Pittsburgh." His words were not requests. They were commands delivered with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. My chest tightened. I swallowed hard and spoke carefully. I have already paid for the venue, the band, the flowers. There is no money left. Lobster and champagne are not possible. The silence that followed was thick and dangerous. Ethan scoffed, tossing his phone on the table with a loud clatter. "You are always so cheap, Sarah. This is my wedding. Make it happen." Janet's glass hit the table with a sharp thud, her eyes narrowing. "He is right. This is once in a lifetime. Why are you being so selfish?" Robert finally looked up, his voice gruff. "Do not ruin this for your brother." I felt heat rise to my cheeks. My pulse throbbed in my ears. For a moment, I thought I might explode, that I might scream out everything I had endured, everything I had sacrificed. Instead, I forced my voice to stay steady, though it trembled with emotion. I have spent $10,000 of my own savings. The budget is maxed out. I cannot keep pouring money I do not have into this. Ethan leaned back, smirking, then turned to Lindsay. "See? I told you she would skimp on us." Lindsay lowered her gaze, silent, her hands twisting nervously in her lap. Janet folded her arms, her voice sharp as glass. "You have always been like this, Sarah, never stepping up when it matters." Robert added without hesitation. "Brent deserves better than your half-effort." He always called Ethan by his middle name in moments of false pride, as if giving him a different title made him grander. I stared at them, my vision blurring with tears I refused to shed. Half-effort. $10,000 gone. Years of my life sacrificed. Sleepless nights in the store. And still they branded me as less. I pushed my chair back, the sound scraping against the hardwood. My voice rose without my permission, breaking through the silence. "I have done everything you asked. I have carried this family, paid for this wedding, given up my dreams, and it is never enough." Ethan smirked wider. "Then maybe you should not be involved at all." Janet leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "You know what, Sarah? The greatest gift for your brother's wedding is you vanishing from this family forever." The room went deadly still. Lindsay's fork clinked against her plate as she dropped it in shock. Robert's face remained blank, as if carved from stone. Ethan's grin widened, feeding off my humiliation. I wanted to scream, to list every sacrifice, every bruise, every late night spent saving them. But the look in their eyes told me nothing I said would matter. They had chosen Ethan as they always had. My existence was an inconvenience, my efforts invisible. Slowly, I stood my chair, groaning under the weight of my decision. My purse hung on the back of the chair. I grabbed it, the keys jangling in my trembling hand. My voice came low but steady. "If that is what you want, then so be it." Janet called after me as I walked toward the door. "Do not make a scene, Sarah." But I was done listening. I pulled the door open, the night air rushing in cold against my flushed skin. With one final slam, the house fell silent behind me, the echo of it marking the end of everything I had known. Outside, the streetlights cast long shadows across the snow, the air sharp in my lungs. I gripped the steering wheel of my car, my mind racing, my heart pounding. Their words, echoed like a curse, vanish forever. For the first time, I felt the fire inside me burn hotter than my fear. They had taken my money, my future, my dignity. Now they had thrown me away. Fine, but I would not fade quietly. They had mistaken me for weak. They had mistaken my silence for submission. What they would see next was not the daughter they thought they controlled, but a woman ready to reclaim her power. That night, as I sat alone in my car, the resolve hardened inside me. Tomorrow they would wake to find out what happened when I stopped carrying their weight. The storm they unleashed would consume their perfect plans, and it would begin with me taking back everything they had stolen. When I woke the next morning, the air in my room felt different, sharper, like the first breath after breaking the surface of water. Their words, still burned in my ears, vanish forever, but instead of crushing me, they fueled me. For 19 years, I had been their servant, their scapegoat, their endless supply of sacrifice. That night, something snapped, and now I saw the truth with painful clarity. They had told me to disappear. Fine. But I would disappear on my own terms, and I would make sure the hole I left behind was wide enough for them to fall into. The first thing I did was open my laptop and log into my bank account. My hands trembled as I stared at the numbers. $10,000. Every cent of my savings had been funneled into their fantasy wedding. But most of it was still sitting in deposits with caterers, florists, musicians, and rental companies. They thought they had bled me dry, but I realized now that the money was not gone. It was retrievable. It was mine. I had leverage. I began with the caterer, a woman in Erie whose cheerful voice faltered when I explained the situation. "I need to cancel the order," I said, keeping my voice steady. She hesitated, reminding me of cancellation penalties, but I pressed firmly. "The deposit was mine. I am the one who paid. Refund it to my account." I gave her my details and hung up before guilt could soften my resolve. Next came the florist. I dialed the number with my pulse racing, my mind flashing images of Ethan smirking at that dinner table. When the florist asked why I did not offer details, no roses, no centerpieces. Refund the deposit. Her sigh carried disappointment, but within minutes she confirmed the money would return to my card. I leaned back in my chair, a smile tugging at the corners of my mouth. For the first time in years, I felt like I had seized control. The band was trickier. They had already cashed my check, and the man on the line bristled at my demand. "We booked months ago." "Non-refundable," but I refused to back down. "The payment was unauthorized," I said firmly. "I will be filing a chargeback with my bank if the refund is not processed." Silence stretched, then a reluctant agreement. Another piece of their dream slipped through their fingers, and another piece of my power returned to me. By noon, most of the $10,000 had begun to flow back into my account. I stared at the numbers, my chest rising and falling with exhilaration. The very money they had forced from me was now returning dollar by dollar into my possession. I imagined their faces when the wedding day arrived with no flowers, no music, no food. They had cast me aside, told me to vanish. I would give them exactly what they asked for. But the turning point was not just about money. It was about shifting the balance of power. For years they had manipulated me with guilt and fear. If I said no, I was selfish. If I resisted, I was ungrateful. They counted on my silence. That morning, I broke it not with shouting, but with action. With every call I made, I rewrote the rules of our relationship. I was no longer their daughter to be controlled. I was the one pulling the strings. As the day stretched on, I walked through Buffalo with a lightness I had never felt. Snow crunched beneath my boots, the gray sky heavy overhead, but inside me the storm had cleared. I stopped by the coffee shop where I worked part-time, sipped a latte, and for once tasted freedom instead of exhaustion. I pulled out my notebook, the one filled with marketing ideas, and sketched plans for myself rather than for them. For years, I had built strategies to save their store, their name, their pride. Now I started designing campaigns for a different client me. I could almost hear Nathan's voice in my head when I called him later that afternoon. "I did it," I said breathlessly. "I canceled everything. I got the money back." For a moment, he was silent. Then his laughter burst through the line. "Sarah, finally. You finally chose yourself." His words wrapped around me like a blanket. I was not crazy. I was not cruel. I was taking back what was mine. That night, instead of lying awake drowning in dread, I slept soundly. Dreams came not of their shouting, but of a future where I walked freely unburdened. In the morning, I checked my account again, watching as refunds posted one by one. The numbers climbed proof of my rebellion etched in digital ink. Robert did not call. Janet did not text. Ethan sent no smug messages. At first, the silence unnerved me, but then I realized they had no idea. They assumed I was still bending, still scrambling to fulfill their impossible demands. They would find out soon enough. 2 days later, Janet's voice shrieked through my voicemail. "Sarah, what have you done? The caterer canceled. The florist says no order is pending." The band called Ethan to confirm withdrawal. "You have ruined everything." Her words cracked with fury, but underneath I heard fear. Their perfect facade was crumbling, and for once I was not the one scrambling to fix it. Robert's message came next, his voice low and cold. "You are a disgrace to this family." But the words no longer pierced me. They bounced off powerless against the shield I had built. Ethan's message dripped with venom. "You will regret this. I will destroy you." I deleted it without flinching. Because the truth was simple, I had already destroyed the illusion they lived on. The night before the wedding, I sat in my small apartment sipping tea while the city outside settled into quiet. My phone buzzed with more voicemails, but I ignored them. I thought of Janet's face when she hurled that plate, Robert's silence, Ethan's grin. Tomorrow their big day would unravel. Tomorrow the guests would arrive expecting glamour and find chaos. Tomorrow they would finally taste what it felt like to be humiliated. I closed my eyes and let the feeling wash over me. This was my turning point. No longer their servant, no longer their scapegoat, no longer the invisible daughter desperate for scraps of affection. I was my own person now, holding their strings in my hands. And as the clock ticked closer to midnight, I whispered to myself, steady and certain, "Let them see what happens when the girl they dismissed decides to fight back." The morning of Ethan's wedding dawned gray and heavy over Erie, Pennsylvania, as though even the sky sensed what was about to happen. Guests arrived in their best clothes heels, clicking on pavement-polished shoes, crunching gravel voices bright with anticipation. Cars lined the streets near the rented hall, an old building dressed up with string lights and banners that promised grandeur. From the outside, it looked prepared for celebration, but inside, the cracks showed instantly. The first guests stepped through the doors, expecting a warm reception, music filling the air, flowers adorning every table. Instead, they were greeted by silence. The chairs were in place, but the tables sat bare white linens wrinkled and unadorned. No roses, no centerpieces, no soft arrangements to soften the edges. The bandstand was empty. The microphone's unplugged cords curled lifeless on the floor. In the kitchen, staff scrambled, confusion etched across their faces because no food had arrived. Trays that should have held lobster and champagne sat barren. The hum of preparation was missing, replaced by the rising murmur of disoriented guests. By mid-morning, whispers spread like wildfire. "Where are the flowers?" one aunt hissed, fanning herself with the invitation. "I thought there was supposed to be music," another relative muttered, her heels tapping impatiently. Couples leaned into each other, speculating. Some chuckled nervously, assuming there had been a delay. Others frowned already, sensing something was terribly wrong. Ethan stormed through the hall with his tie half knotted, his phone glued to his ear. "What do you mean the band canceled?" he barked into the receiver. His face turned redder with every word. He hung up only to dial another number, pacing like a caged animal. Janet trailed behind him, her voice shrill. "Call the florist again!" They must have made a mistake. Robert followed with heavy steps, muttering curses under his breath. Lindsay, in her wedding gown, stood near the stage with trembling hands clutching her bouquet of leftover supermarket flowers, the only decoration they had managed to scrounge at the last minute. Her eyes darted across the room, wide with humiliation. Guests gathered in clusters, their whispers rising. "This is a disaster. Did they not pay the vendors? How could they let this happen?" Every word struck Ethan like a lash, his perfect image unraveling before an audience he had expected to impress. Janet rushed to the kitchen, demanding answers from the staff. "Where is the food?" she screeched. The chef threw up his hands. No delivery, no order, nothing to cook. Robert's jaw clenched so tightly it seemed he might crack a tooth. I was not there to witness it firsthand, but the reports reached me quickly. My phone buzzed with message after message, voice after voice layering the chaos. Janet's voice shrill with panic. "Sarah, what have you done? You've ruined everything." Robert's voice cold and heavy. "You are a disgrace." Ethan's voice, venom dripping. "This is on you. You will regret it." I sat in my Buffalo apartment with a steaming cup of coffee, the snow falling gently outside, and let each voicemail play without flinching. For once, their rage did not crush me. It liberated me. Back in Erie, the guests' frustration boiled over. Chairs scraped as people debated leaving. A cousin muttered loudly enough for the room to hear, "They have money for law school, but not for food." An uncle shook his head. All show no responsibility. The humiliation mounted visible on every face of the Donnelly family. Janet's makeup smeared from tears she tried to hide. Robert disappeared outside for a smoke, his shoulders hunched with defeat. Ethan shouted at staff at Lindsay, at anyone within reach. Lindsay's eyes filled with tears, her hands trembling until she dropped the bouquet onto the floor. Then the breaking point arrived. The officiant approached Ethan quietly, asking if they should proceed with the ceremony at least. Ethan exploded, his voice carrying across the hall. "How can we proceed when there is nothing here? This is supposed to be perfect." His shout silenced the crowd for a beat, then unleashed a wave of murmurs. Phones came out, pictures snapped, whispers traveled online before the ceremony even began. By afternoon, the story was spreading across Erie. The Donnelly wedding had collapsed into shambles. In Buffalo, I refreshed my laptop screen, watching the gossip board light up with posts. No food at the Donnelly wedding. Guests leaving early, chaos inside. Comments stacked one after another, some mocking, others sympathetic, all feeding the flames. I leaned back in my chair, letting the warmth of justice settle into my bones. They had thrown me away like trash, and now their perfect image lay in ruins for everyone to see. Nathan came by that afternoon, slipping into my apartment with a smirk. "You should see it, Sarah. People are talking all over town. They are calling it the wedding without flowers." He chuckled, setting down a bag of pastries on my table. "Your brother looks like a fool." I smiled, a sharp, satisfied smile, though inside I felt more than triumph. I felt release. Years of silence, of swallowing pain, of carrying their burdens, it had all led to this unraveling. The wedding limped forward in fragments. Some guests stayed out of pity, nibbling on crackers hastily bought from a corner store. The band never arrived. The photographer canceled. Janet tried to gather people for speeches, but the room was restless, impatient. Lindsay's parents looked horrified, whispering heatedly in a corner, their disappointment plain. Ethan drank glass after glass of cheap wine, his anger spilling into every word. "She did this," he hissed to anyone who would listen. "My sister sabotaged me." His accusations only deepened the humiliation because guests now saw not a wronged groom, but a man unraveling in public. By nightfall, the once grand celebration had disintegrated. Guests left early, shaking their heads, carrying gossip that would ripple through Erie for weeks. Lindsay retreated to the bridal suite in tears, refusing to face anyone. Janet collapsed into a chair, her eyes vacant, muttering that she did not understand. Robert drowned himself in silence and alcohol, his presence fading into the background. Ethan raged until his voice cracked, then stormed outside, leaving his shattered wedding behind. Back in Buffalo, I watched the snow fall thicker, muffling the world outside my window. My phone still buzzed with calls I ignored. I thought of that plate shattering against my shoulder, of Janet's scream, telling me to get out forever. Now, in a twist so sharp it felt poetic, it was they who were being cast out by their own failures. I had not lifted a hand against them. I had simply stopped carrying their weight. The void revealed who they truly were. Late that night, Nathan returned with updates. "It is over," he said simply. "Guests are furious. Lindsay looks like she wants to disappear. Your parents, they are broken." I nodded, sipping the last of my coffee, my chest rising with a deep, steady breath. I felt no guilt, only clarity. This was not cruelty. This was consequence. The next morning, Erie buzzed with the fallout. Photos circulated of empty tables, guests in coats leaving early Lindsay's tear-streaked face. Rumors spread that vendors had pulled out because of unpaid bills. Neighbors whispered that the Donnellys were finished. For once, the whispers did not involve me. I was free of their shadow, watching from a distance as their empire of control collapsed. That was the day I knew the balance had shifted permanently. I was no longer their scapegoat. I was the witness to their unraveling, the architect of their downfall, though they would never admit it. And as I closed my laptop and prepared for the next chapter of my life, I whispered again the vow I had made in my car that night. I would never kneel to their cruelty again. The aftermath of the wedding spread across Erie and Buffalo faster than any fire. Within a day, neighbors were whispering in grocery aisles, posts popped up on local forums, and even the coffee shop where I worked buzzed with talk of the disaster. "Did you hear about the Donnelly wedding?" people asked each other, shaking their heads, eyes widening at the details. No food, no flowers, no music. Guests leaving in frustration. It was the kind of public humiliation small towns never forget. For years, my parents had clung to their image of respectability. Robert, the hardworking store owner, Janet, the dedicated mother, Ethan, the golden child destined for greatness. In one night, the entire facade cracked open, and through those cracks spilled every truth they had tried to bury. Ethan returned to Cleveland after the wreckage, but news followed him. Students at his law program whispered behind his back, their curiosity sharp. Was it true the vendors all pulled out? Did his family not pay? He walked through halls with his head high, but the smirks around him cut deeper than he admitted. Lindsay drifted further from his side, her parents pressuring her to reconsider. He cannot even manage a wedding, her mother was overheard saying. By the end of the semester, Lindsay ended the engagement quietly. The diamond ring slipped back into its box. Ethan's fury carried through phone calls to my parents, but nothing could undo the humiliation. Back in Buffalo, the family store wobbled under the weight of neglect. Without me managing schedules, negotiating with vendors, or designing the small campaigns that kept customers trickling in, the shelves emptied. Robert tried to manage inventory, but his drinking made him forget orders. Janet attempted to keep books, but numbers confused her, and soon unpaid bills piled high again. Vendors who once trusted me refused to extend credit to them. Too risky, they said flatly. Customers noticed the decline. They stopped coming, preferring the clean aisles of larger chains. Each week, foot traffic shrank and whispers grew louder. The Donnellys were finished. I withdrew the small investment I had once poured into the store. Every cent I had given them over the years, $5,000 here, $10,000 there, had gone unacknowledged, but this time I reclaimed it. The bank processed my withdrawal without issue. My name disappeared from the accounts, leaving Robert and Janet to face the crumbling walls alone. They did not call to beg at first. Their pride was too thick. But I knew the day would come when even pride would collapse under debt. Meanwhile, gossip turned cruel. At the coffee shop, a group of women in their 50s leaned over their lattes, lowering their voices just enough to keep me listening. I heard Janet screamed at Sarah during dinner, one said. I heard she threw something, another added. Their eyes darted around as though I might appear. They did not know I was already there, wiping down tables with my apron tied tight. I bit back a smile because finally the story was shifting. For once the shame was not mine to carry. Robert's reputation slipped fastest. He had once been a man people nodded to on the street, a man whose handshake was supposed to mean something. Now he walked with shoulders hunched, avoiding eyes. Neighbors whispered about his drinking, his failure to keep the store alive, his silence when his wife humiliated their daughter. Janet fared no better. She had built her pride on appearances, attending church in her best dresses, smiling brightly at bake sales. But in whispers behind her back, people called her cruel, selfish, blind. Mothers shook their heads, saying they would never treat their own daughters that way. The final blow came when the store officially declared bankruptcy. Notices appeared on the windows shelves cleared out by creditors. The doors locked permanently one gray morning, leaving Robert standing on the sidewalk with his hands shoved deep in his coat pockets, staring at the ghost of what had once been his pride. Janet sobbed in the car, her mascara streaking down her cheeks. Ethan was not there. He had cut himself off, blaming them even as he blamed me. Nathan updated me with every step. "They are falling apart without you," he said one evening, sliding into the booth at the diner where we met. He pushed a cup of coffee toward me, his eyes steady. "The store is gone. Lindsay left Ethan. Your parents are barely speaking to anyone." I stirred sugar into my cup, listening quietly. The old me would have felt guilt and ache in my chest for their suffering. But the new me understood. These were not tragedies I caused. These were consequences they had invited by rejecting me, by treating me as expendable. The Donnellys' fall was public and merciless. Neighbors who once waved now crossed the street to avoid them. Friends stopped answering calls. At church, Janet's smile faltered under the weight of cold stares. Robert sank deeper into the bottle, his once booming laugh reduced to mutters at the end of the bar. Ethan, stripped of his engagement and mocked at school, retreated into bitterness. None of them admitted their mistakes. None of them reached out to apologize. They only grew more resentful, their anger aimed at me like arrows that could no longer pierce. In contrast, I felt lighter. I signed the papers to sell the small freelance client list I had built in Buffalo, earning $25,000. Combined with the $10,000 I reclaimed from the wedding, I had enough to leave the city behind. Asheville, North Carolina called to me with its mountains, its fresh air, its promise of starting over. I packed 2 suitcases, closed the door on my cramped apartment, and boarded a bus south. With every mile that carried me away from Buffalo, the weight on my chest loosened. By the time the bus wound through the Blue Ridge Mountains, I breathed freely for the first time in years. While my family stumbled through public humiliation, I stepped into anonymity, into freedom. Shirley Bennett welcomed me into her bakery with flour on her apron and kindness in her voice. She introduced me to local shop owners who needed marketing help. Soon, I was writing ad copy for a coffee roaster, designing flyers for a hiking gear store, building websites for boutiques. The income was modest, but it was mine. Each paycheck felt like proof that I could live without their chains. In Erie and Buffalo, the Donnellys' name became a cautionary tale. Do not put all your weight on one child while ignoring the other, older women whispered. Look what happened to them. People speculated about the wedding disaster, about the bankruptcy, about the daughter who had walked away. They guessed at details, some close to the truth, some twisted by rumor. I did not correct them. I did not need to. Their downfall spoke louder than any defense I could have made. The public consequences of that one broken wedding were not just humiliation. They were the unraveling of an entire dynasty my parents had built on lies and favoritism. Without me, they had no foundation. Without me, they had no future. And while they sank, I rose. I did not watch gleefully. There was no celebration in my heart, only clarity. This was balance restoring itself, justice unfolding in plain sight. I had spent years carrying their weight, covering their flaws, sacrificing my dreams. When I stopped, their world collapsed because it had been built on my back all along. And as the news of their fall reached me in Asheville, I looked out over the mountains and let the wind brush against my face. The girl who had once cleaned up their broken glass was gone. In her place stood a woman who understood that sometimes the only way to survive a toxic family was to let them face the world without you. And when they did, the world saw them for who they really were. Moving to Asheville, North Carolina, was like stepping into a different life. The bus wound through the Blue Ridge Mountains, green and endless, their peaks catching the early morning light as though the earth itself was reminding me that beauty existed beyond pain. When I arrived downtown with 2 suitcases and a notebook full of marketing sketches, I felt like a blank page waiting to be written. Buffalo's cold grip loosened with every breath of mountain air. For the first time in years, I felt possibility rather than dread. I rented a small 1-bedroom apartment above a bookstore on Lexington Avenue. The walls were bare, the carpet worn, but when I opened the window, I could hear the city hum softly below street musicians strumming guitars, the scent of fresh bread drifting from a bakery down the block. That bakery became my anchor. The sign read, Bennett's Bakes, and inside, flour dusted the counters and laughter filled the air. Shirley Bennett, the owner, greeted me on my first visit with a scone slid across the counter. "You look new here," she said with a smile that warmed me more than the pastry. I nodded, telling her briefly that I had just moved. She did not ask for details. Instead, she told me her story, how she had started fresh after a divorce in her 50s, how the bakery saved her. "Starting over takes guts," she said, handing me a steaming coffee. For the first time, I felt like someone saw me without judgment. Within weeks, Shirley introduced me to others in the community. A coffee roaster needed someone to design flyers for a tasting event. A boutique wanted help setting up social media ads. A hiking gear shop asked for a simple website refresh. Each small project lit a fire in me. I worked late nights at my little desk, sketching logos, drafting taglines, sending drafts to grateful owners who thanked me with sincerity my family had never shown. The checks were modest, $200 here, $500 there, but they added up. Within a month, I was earning between $2,500 and $3,000. It was not wealth, but it was independence. Every dollar came from my own skill, not from sacrifice to someone else's ego. Slowly, my apartment filled with life. I bought a second-hand rug from a market, potted plants for the windowsill, a bookshelf for my notebooks. I painted watercolors again, a hobby I had abandoned in Buffalo. My evenings were no longer consumed with worry about bills I could not cover for my parents or insults hurled across the dinner table. Instead, I cooked simple meals, sipped tea, and read novels. The silence in my apartment was peaceful, not heavy. Shirley became more than a landlord of kindness. She became a mentor. She invited me to business meetups where shop owners exchanged ideas and encouraged each other. "This is Sarah," she would say proudly. "She is sharp with marketing. She will take care of you." Her faith in me was a kind of healing I had not known I needed. Each introduction became a brick in the foundation of my new life. Nathan remained a voice from afar, calling me every couple of weeks from Buffalo. He would tell me updates about the wreckage my family left behind, but he also reminded me that I had chosen the right path. "You sound different," he said one evening as the line crackled. Lighter. And I was. I no longer carried the invisible burden of trying to earn Janet's approval or Robert's acknowledgement. Their silence now was not punishment. It was freedom. The first true moment of triumph came when I signed a contract with the Regional Tourism Board. They wanted a 6-month campaign to promote hiking trails and local festivals. The deal doubled my income overnight. I sat in Shirley's bakery with the signed papers in my hand, tears pricking my eyes. Shirley patted my arm. "See, you are building something here. Something yours." Her words sank deep. She was right. I was building not just a career, but a life that reflected who I truly was. My days filled with purpose. Mornings began with coffee at Bennett's, afternoons with client meetings in cafes, evenings with design work at my desk. On weekends, I hiked the trails of Black Balsam Knob and Craggy Gardens, the mountains stretching wide, reminding me of resilience. With each step on those trails, I shed the remnants of Buffalo, the insults, the bruises, the fear. The people of Asheville did not know me as the scapegoat daughter or the failed sister. They knew me as Sarah, the young woman with bright ideas and a steady hand. Clients praised my work, thanked me for boosting their sales, recommended me to others. Each word of gratitude felt like balm soothing the wounds left by years of dismissal. In quiet moments, I reflected on what I had lost and what I had gained. Buffalo had stolen my childhood, drained my finances, and broken my trust. But Asheville gave me choice, independence, and dignity. The contrast was stark. I realized then that family is not always the people who share your blood. Sometimes family is the people who hand you a scone when you are new, who believe in your abilities, who stand beside you without asking for more than you can give. The new beginning did not erase the past, but it redefined it. My scars became lessons. My losses became fuel. My silence became strength. I was not the girl who cleaned up broken glass anymore. I was the woman who built campaigns, hiked mountains, and carved her own place in the world. And as I looked out the window of my small apartment at the Blue Ridge peaks glowing in sunset light, I whispered to myself with quiet conviction, "This is home." It was late autumn in Asheville when the letter arrived. The air outside carried the scent of wood smoke, and the sidewalks were carpeted with fallen leaves in shades of red and gold. I had just returned from a meeting with the tourism board, my backpack heavy with drafts of slogans for their winter campaign. When I opened my mailbox, I noticed the envelope immediately. The handwriting was familiar, the slant of the letters sharp and rushed. Janet Donnelly. My mother. I carried it upstairs to my apartment, set it on the table, and stared at it for a long time. Part of me wanted to throw it directly into the trash to let it rot there with all the other demands they had made of me. But curiosity won. I slid it open and unfolded the pages. The words were desperate from the start. Janet claimed that the family was drowning. The store was gone, the debts had piled higher than ever, and now creditors were threatening to take the house. "We need $60,000, Sarah," she wrote. "Please, you are the only one who can save us. You must come home." My eyes lingered on the words, only one. The irony of it slicing through me. For years, I had been invisible to them, treated as expendable, told to vanish forever. Now, suddenly, I was the only one who mattered because I had something they wanted. The letter went on pleading and twisting guilt like a knife. "We are still your parents. Blood is thicker than water. Think of your brother. He cannot focus on his studies with this weight on us. We know you have money. Please do not abandon your family." At the end, Janet's handwriting wavered, almost shaking. "We are begging you." I set the letter down and stared at the ceiling. My chest tightened, not with guilt, but with disbelief. The same woman who had hurled a plate at me screaming that I should get out forever now begged me to return with $60,000. The same father who had called me a disgrace now wanted my help. The same brother who had smirked at my pain expected me to save him from ruin. I called Nathan that evening, my voice shaking with anger. "They want 60,000, I told him. He was silent for a long moment, then let out a sharp laugh. "Unbelievable. After everything they did now, they crawl back to you." His voice hardened. "Do not give them a cent, Sarah. Not one." Shirley saw the letter when I carried it into the bakery the next morning. She wiped flour from her hands, read the lines, and shook her head. "This smells like manipulation," she said bluntly. "People do not change overnight. They are not sorry. They are desperate." She tossed the letter onto the counter. "You worked for every dollar you have now. Do not let them drag you back." Still, the request rattled me. $60,000. I thought of how many campaigns I would have to run, how many hours of work it represented. It was more money than I had ever seen in one place, and they believed I could hand it over like water. My stomach churned at the thought. That night, I lay awake staring at the shadows on my ceiling. Memories replayed in my mind, Janet's voice shrieking as the plate flew. Robert's silence, Ethan's smug grin. The loneliness of cleaning up broken glass. The sting of being told to vanish forever. Did they really think a single letter could erase that? Did they really believe that I would bow my head and return $60,000 in hand as though none of it had happened? I realized then that their plea was not about love. It was about control. Even in their desperation, they were trying to bind me to drag me back into the web I had finally escaped. $60,000 was not just money. It was the leash they wanted to slip around my neck again. The next morning, I sat at my desk with a blank sheet of paper. I wrote my reply slowly, carefully. "I wish you well," I began, my hand steady. "But I am not your savior anymore. I will not return to Buffalo. I will not send money. The choices you made are yours to live with. I have chosen a different life." I signed my name, folded the letter, and slipped it into an envelope. At the post office, I dropped it into the outgoing bin, my heart lightening with the sound of it landing inside. For a moment, doubt crept in. Was I being cruel? Was I abandoning them in their worst moment? But then I remembered how they had abandoned me over and over, the time they drained my college savings, the night they told me to vanish forever, the years they chose Ethan while I bled myself dry. No, this was not cruelty. This was justice. Weeks passed and I heard nothing from them directly, but Nathan sent me updates. The house was seized by the bank. Janet and Robert moved into a cramped apartment on the edge of Erie. Neighbors who once smiled now turned away. Ethan, stripped of his engagement and his dignity, took a part-time job at Home Depot, his arrogance gone replaced by bitterness. They were crumbling, and they wanted me to carry the blame. But I refused. In Asheville, I thrived. My contracts expanded, my client list grew. I earned enough to buy better furniture for my apartment, to take weekend trips into the mountains, to live without fear. Shirley's Bakery became my second home, a place where laughter replaced the sharpness of my mother's voice, where kindness was offered without condition. When I thought of the $60,000 they had begged for, I did not feel regret. I felt gratitude that I had learned to say no. Gratitude that I had stepped out of the shadow of their control, gratitude that my life was finally mine. And as I walked through the streets of Asheville one crisp evening, the lights of shops glowing music drifting from a nearby bar, I realized something profound. They had asked me to save them, but in truth, I had saved myself. The first snow of winter drifted softly over Asheville, clinging to rooftops and tree branches, dusting the Blue Ridge peaks in white. I stood at my window one evening watching flakes swirl in the glow of the streetlights and thought about how far I had come. Buffalo felt like another lifetime, a place that lived only in the scars on my heart and the lessons etched in my bones. My family had begged me for $60,000, tried to pull me back into the same chains I had broken, but I had chosen differently. I had chosen myself. That choice was not simple. In quiet moments, the memories still stung. I would recall Robert's silence, his eyes fixed on his plate while Janet hurled words like knives. I would hear Ethan's laughter sharp and cruel as if my suffering were entertainment. I remembered the sound of glass shattering the night Janet threw the plate at me, her voice screaming, "Get out forever!" and how I walked into the cold air with tears burning my eyes. Those moments used to define me. Now they reminded me why I could never return. In the months after refusing their plea, the news trickled back through Nathan. He called one night while sanding wood in his shop. They lost the house, he told me, his voice calm but heavy. Janet is working as a cashier at a grocery chain. Robert spends most days drinking. Ethan barely talks to anyone. People say he is bitter, angry, and stuck. I listened in silence, feeling a complicated mix of emotions. Part of me pitied them, seeing how far they had fallen. Another part of me felt vindicated, knowing their collapse was the natural consequence of years of cruelty and arrogance. But above all, I felt distance. Their story was no longer mine to carry. In Asheville, my life had grown roots. The tourism board campaign succeeded, drawing thousands of visitors to local trails and shops. The boutique I helped doubled its sales. The hiking gear store expanded, crediting my ads with the boom. I built a reputation not as the forgotten daughter, but as Sarah Donnelly marketing consultant, someone who delivered results. Shirley cheered me on at every step, sliding muffins across the counter with a wink. "Fuel for your empire," she joked, and I laughed because for once the empire was mine. I painted again, filling sketchbooks with watercolor landscapes of mountains and streams. I joined a hiking group trekking to Black Balsam Knob at sunrise, the sky unfolding in waves of pink and gold. Standing on those ridges, wind whipping my hair, I felt something I had never known in Buffalo freedom without fear. No one was waiting to drag me down. No one was measuring me against Ethan. No one was telling me to vanish. Sometimes letters arrived from Buffalo, though fewer as time passed. I stopped opening them. The envelopes sat in a drawer, reminders of a life I had left behind. I did not need to read them to know what they contained: pleas, guilt, blame. I had written my final answer already, and nothing more needed to be said. Closure did not come in one dramatic moment. It came in small pieces. It came in the way clients shook my hand and thanked me sincerely. It came in the way Shirley called me family without asking for anything in return. It came in the way Nathan's voice steadied me over the phone, reminding me of my strength. It came in the way I looked at myself in the mirror and no longer saw a shadow, but a woman who had built a life out of rubble. One crisp morning, months after the letter demanding $60,000, I hiked alone up a trail that wound steeply through the forest. The climb was hard, my lungs burning, my legs aching, but I pressed on. At the summit, I stood overlooking the Blue Ridge Mountains, the horizon stretching endlessly. I closed my eyes, let the wind fill my lungs, and whispered the truth I had carried for so long. Family is not where you are born. It is where you are valued. That was the lesson Buffalo had carved into me with every insult, every bruise, every betrayal. That was the lesson Asheville had confirmed with every kind gesture, every opportunity, every moment of peace. I could not change where I came from, but I could choose where I was going. I turned from the mountains with a smile, my boots crunching on the frosted earth. For years I had believed love had to be earned through sacrifice, that respect came only when you bled yourself dry. Now I knew better. Love is not begged for. Respect is not bought with silence. Value is not measured by what you give away, but by how fiercely you protect your worth. As the snow melted into spring, I painted my apartment walls a soft shade of blue, the color of freedom. I planted herbs on the windowsill, their scent filling the room as sunlight poured in. I took on new clients, expanded my work, and built friendships rooted in trust. My past no longer haunted me, it instructed me. It reminded me never to kneel again, never to hand over my power, never to confuse blood with love. In Buffalo, the Donnellys faded into obscurity, their names whispered not with pride, but with pity. In Asheville, I thrived, and when I think of the girl I once was, the girl cleaning up broken glass, the girl silenced at every turn, I wish I could tell her this one day: you will walk away, and when you do, you will find the world is bigger and brighter than you ever imagined. Standing once more on a Blue Ridge trail, the sun setting in a blaze of orange and gold, I breathed deeply, my heart steady. This was my closure. This was my reflection. I had not just survived my family, I had built a life they could never touch, and for the first time I felt not just alive, but free.